January chill in Paris, California, felt like a knife against the flesh of a girl who seemed to be 10, though she was actually 17. She remained trembling beneath a street lamp, gripping an inactive cell phone discovered in a heap of household trash. When the dispatcher responded, she stated that she had just climbed through a window to escape a nightmare. Behind the ordinary exterior of her home, 12 siblings remained chained to beds with heavy padlocks. This was the instant the world first learned the name Turpin, a family that used the cover of suburban normalcy to conceal a literal house of horrors. To understand the decay that eventually consumed the house on Muirwood Road, one must travel back to the late 1950s and early 60s to the rugged hills of West Virginia. David Cyrus Turpin was born into a life shaped by traditional values and a quiet, nearly sterile brand of middle-class stability. His father, James, was a man who valued order and religious devotion. David was the type of child who stayed unnoticed, the quiet boy in the corner who excelled in math but struggled to meet the gaze of his peers. He was a man of precision, a quality that would later guide him into the world of high-stakes aerospace engineering. But it was a precision that concealed a deeply growing need for absolute control over his surroundings. By the early 1980s, David had relocated to Virginia. His life centered around his studies and the strict principles of his faith. It was during a church service that he first noticed Louise Robinette. She was barely out of childhood, just 16 years old, with a background that was much more fractured than his own. Louise had grown up in a home where limits were often blurred and instability was the sole constant. She was searching for a savior, someone to provide the firm structure she lacked. David, 7 years her senior, appeared like that savior. Their courtship was not a romance of shared dreams, but one of shared loneliness. David began to isolate Louise from her family almost immediately, convinced that the outside world was a corrupting influence meant to tear them apart. In 1984, the tension reached a breaking point. When Louise's family attempted to interfere, the couple did the unthinkable. They eloped. They escaped across state lines, sparking a desperate police chase that ended with a confrontation between David and Louise's father. But the law at the time saw a young woman who claimed to be in love, and the couple was permitted to vanish into the vastness of the American South. They settled in Fort Worth, Texas. For a time, they were the image of the American dream, albeit a blurry one. David secured a prestigious position as an engineer for Lockheed Martin and later Northrop Grumman. He was the kind of employee companies valued: quiet, dependable, and possessed of a high security clearance that suggested a man of unquestionable character. He spent his days developing complex systems for fighter jets and surveillance technology, while his nights were spent creating a far more sinister system at home. Louise, meanwhile, was sinking deeper into a specific radicalized interpretation of Pentecostalism. She believed that her purpose on earth was a biological one, to birth as many children as God would allow. To Louise, every pregnancy was a triumph in a spiritual war. Every child was a warrior for a kingdom that only she and David truly understood. This wasn't just a large family. It was the start of a cult of two where David was the unquestioned patriarch and Louise was his high priestess. As the children began to arrive, one after another, year after year, the walls of their world began to deepen. In Texas, the neighbors started to notice a pattern that didn't match the suburban mold. The Turpin children were seldom seen during the daylight hours. When they were spotted, they appeared like ghosts, waif-like figures with pale skin and hollow eyes, dressed in matching outdated outfits that looked like they belonged in a previous century. David and Louise were experts of the veneer. They would occasionally take the children to Disney World, dressing them in bright, identical shirts and lining them up for photographs. To a casual observer, it looked like a quirky, perhaps overly disciplined family. But if you looked at the children's faces in those photos, the smiles never reached their eyes. By the late 90s, the family began to spiral financially despite David's six-figure salary. The expense of maintaining 13 people and the couple's growing shopping addiction was overwhelming. They filed for bankruptcy in 2011, but even then the system failed to recognize the red flags. The bankruptcy court saw a family struggling with debt, not a family where the children were being systematically starved. David realized that to keep his secret, he needed a cover. He registered his home as a private school, the Sandcastle Day School. This legal loophole allowed him to bypass state oversight. There were no teachers, no curriculum, and no outside eyes. The children were no longer students of the state. They were subjects of the Turpin regime. The move from Texas to California was not just a change of scenery. It was a strategic withdrawal. They were relocating to a place where they could be close but invisible. In the sprawling suburbs of Riverside County, they found the perfect hiding place. A brand new cul-de-sac where neighbors were too busy with their own lives to wonder why the lights at 112 Muirwood Road only turned on when the rest of the world was going to sleep. David and Louise were no longer just parents. They were the designers of a prison, and their children were the only captives. The transition from the dusty suburbs of Texas to the sunlit hills of California wasn't a move toward a brighter future. It was a strategic expansion of the shadows. By 2010, the Turpins had deserted their home in Rio Vista, leaving behind a trail of filth and unpaid debts that would have signaled a crisis to anyone who cared to look. But in the vast, impersonal landscape of the American West, it is frighteningly easy for a family of 15 to simply disappear. They first settled in Moretta, a town known for its quiet streets and family-friendly atmosphere. It was here that David Turpin perfected the legal shield that would protect his kingdom for nearly a decade. California, for all its progressive reputation, possessed a glaring weakness in its education code. A parent could simply file a private school affidavit, a single sheet of paper that transformed a residential home into an autonomous educational institution. There were no requirements for background checks, no mandatory inspections, and no stat-mandated testing. David christened his nightmare the Sandcastle Day School. On paper, he was the principal. His children were the students. In reality, the school was a black hole where time, education, and basic human rights went to perish. The state saw a functioning private academy. The neighbors saw nothing at all. It was during this period that the vampire schedule became a compulsory rule within the household. David and Louise realized that the greatest threat to their control was the sun. Sunlight brought forth neighbors. It brought forth mail carriers and delivery drivers, and it made the skeletal frames of their children too visible to ignore. The solution was as simple as it was cruel. The family would sleep during the day behind heavy light-blocking curtains and exist during the night. Inside the house, the atmosphere was one of suffocating, stagnant silence. The children were prohibited from talking to one another unless it was necessary. They were prohibited from playing. The only sound that filled the halls at 3 a.m. was the shuffling of feet as the siblings moved in coordinated patterns. A marching exercise David enforced to ensure they stayed active enough to survive, but not healthy enough to resist. The social atmosphere in Moretta was one of profound unease. Neighbors would later recall seeing the children through the flickering blue light of a television screen at midnight. A row of pale, motionless faces, staring at a screen that was often the only window they had to the world they weren't allowed to inhabit. One neighbor remembered seeing a few of the children late at night, searching through the trash for food. When she tried to speak to them, they didn't flee. They simply froze, as if they lacked the basic social ability to process a stranger's voice. By the time the family moved to the final house in Paris, 112 Muirwood Road, the isolation was absolute. The extended family back in West Virginia and Virginia had been systematically ignored. Louise's sister would later explain that she hadn't spoken to Louise in years. Every attempt at contact was met with a wall of silence or a vague excuse from David. The grandparents, who had once been sent photos of the children in matching outfits, were now completely excluded from the family's life. David told his children that their relatives were evil, that the world outside their front door was a den of pedophiles and kidnappers, and that only he and Louise could keep them safe. The financial paradox of the Turpin family is perhaps the most difficult aspect to reconcile. David was earning a six-figure salary as a Heil engineer, yet the family filed for bankruptcy twice. The money didn't go toward high-quality groceries or medical care for the children. Instead, it was channeled into a bizarre, obsessive, compulsive cycle of consumerism. David and Louise were consumed by the thrill of buying things. They packed the garage with expensive toys, strollers, and electronics, most of which remained in their original packaging, while the children slept on the floor. To preserve the veneer of a super family, they occasionally ventured out for elaborate public displays. The most unsettling were the trips to Las Vegas for David and Louise's wedding vow renewals. They visited a chapel multiple times to be married by an Elvis impersonator. In the videos from these events, the children are lined up in identical outfits, the girls in purple dresses with white tights, the boys in matching suits. They look like props in a theatrical production. The Elvis impersonator later remarked that the children were remarkably well behaved, a chilling euphemism for the catatonic state of fear they were actually in. Psychologically, the power dynamic was a closed loop. David was the principal, the supreme authority who held the keys to the padlocks. Louise was the enforcer, the one who monitored the cameras she had installed throughout the house, the one who would strike the children for stealing a piece of bread or for washing their hands above the wrist. They created a world where the only way to survive was to become invisible. But as the years passed and the children grew into adults who still possessed the bodies of children, the walls of the Sandcastle Day School began to crumble from the inside. The children were getting older and they were starting to realize that the safety their parents promised was actually a slow, methodical execution. The air inside 112 Merewood Road didn't circulate. It stagnated, dense with the scent of unwashed bodies, rotting waste, and a peculiar metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. To the outside world, the house was a silent beige box in a row of identical boxes. But once the front door clicked shut, the suburban reality vanished, replaced by a kingdom of filth, where the laws of the modern world ceased to exist. David and Louise Turpin didn't just neglect their children. They created an environment of systematic sensory deprivation. The house was perpetually dark. The heavy curtains never opened, creating a twilight world where the passage of time was measured not by the sun, but by the shifting shadows in the hallway. The vampire schedule was more than a logistical choice. It was a psychological anchor, by forcing the children to remain awake through the night and sleep through the day. The parents ensured that their students were perpetually disoriented, living in a state of chronic jet lag that made resistance almost physically impossible. The physical reality of their confinement was anchored in cold steel. What began years earlier as simple ropes had evolved into something far more industrial. David had purchased heavy-duty chains and padlocks from local hardware stores, the kind designed to secure gates or heavy machinery. These were used to fasten the children to their bunk beds, sometimes for weeks at a time. The sound of the metal clinking against the bed frames became the constant soundtrack of the house. It was a sound that meant total immobilization. The siblings were often chained in a way that prevented them from reaching the bathroom, forcing them to remain in their own waste for days, a humiliation intended to strip away the last vestiges of human dignity. In the rare moments they were unchained, the rules of the house remained just as restrictive. Hygiene was treated as a luxury that was almost never granted. The children were permitted to bathe exactly once a year. If they were caught washing their hands above the wrist, it was seen as a defiance of David's authority, a sin that resulted in punishment. This usually involved being choked, struck, or having their hair pulled until clumps were left in their parents' hands. Because they were never allowed to visit a doctor or a dentist, their bodies began to deteriorate in silence. Their teeth decayed in their gums. Their skin took on a translucent waxen quality from a complete lack of vitamin D. But perhaps the most calculated cruelty was the food game. David and Louise were not just starving their children, they were tormenting them with the concept of abundance. David would frequently return from the grocery store with boxes of frozen pizzas, trays of freshly baked apple pies, or colorful boxes of donuts. He would place these items on the kitchen counter, well within sight of the skeletal children, and forbid them from touching a single crumb. The siblings would be forced to watch as the food slowly spoiled and rotted in front of them. Meanwhile, their own meals consisted of a single frozen burrito or a peanut butter sandwich, often shared between multiple people once a day. The psychological depth of this torture cannot be overstated. By surrounding the children with food they couldn't eat and toys they couldn't touch, many of the Sandcastle Day school supplies remained in their original plastic wrap for a decade. David and Louise created a world of perpetual almost. It was a constant reminder that comfort existed, but it was not for them. The older siblings, some in their late 20s, were trapped in the bodies of prepubescent children. A 29-year-old sister weighed just 82 pounds. Her growth so severely stunted by malnutrition that her internal organs were beginning to resemble those of a woman twice her age. When they weren't chained, the children were often forced to complete schoolwork. This wasn't education. It was a repetitive, hollow ritual. They were given journals and told to write over and over again. They wrote about their love for their parents, about their gratitude for the protection David provided, and thousands of pages of desperate, rambling prayers. It was a form of forced ideological conformity. If the principal checked a journal and found a lack of devotion, the chains would return. In the quiet hours of 4 a.m., while the rest of Paris dreamed of normal lives, the Turpin siblings were often forced to march. They would walk in circles through the cramped, cluttered rooms, weaving around piles of trash and unopened consumer goods. as Louise watched them through a network of cameras she had installed throughout the house. She monitored them from her bed, her eyes fixed on the flickering monitors as she consumed snacks the children were forbidden to touch. This was the why and the how of the Turpin regime. It was a closed ecosystem of control where every basic human need, food, light, movement, hygiene was transformed into a weapon. The children weren't just prisoners, they were being undone. They were being reduced to shadows that moved in the dark, waiting for a permission that almost never came. By the time 2018 arrived, the siblings weren't just looking for an exit. They were looking for a reason to believe that a world outside the beige walls even existed. The decision to break the perimeter of the Sandcastle Day School didn't happen in a single impulsive heartbeat. It was a slow-motion rebellion that had been developing in the mind of 17-year-old Jordan Turpin for nearly 2 years. The catalyst was a digital window she had managed to open in the dark. Jordan had discovered a discarded, deactivated smartphone in a pile of household refuse, a piece of plastic and glass that David and Louise likely considered a paperweight. But to Jordan, it was a lifeline. She had spent months secretly using the house's unsecured Wi-Fi to watch YouTube videos, absorbing the sights of a world where teenagers wore makeup, chose their own clothes, and lived without the constant clink of metal against a bed frame. By January 2018, the internal pressure within 112 Muirwood Road had reached a terminal velocity. David and Louise were talking about moving the family again, this time to Oklahoma. To Jordan and her older siblings, Oklahoma wasn't just a different state. It was a final, inescapable grave. They knew that if they were uprooted once more, the small amount of local awareness they had managed to attract would be reset to zero. The violence was also intensifying. Louise had recently discovered that Jordan was watching videos. The subsequent punishment had been so severe, involving choking and threats of a permanent return to the chains, that Jordan realized she would either die in that house or die trying to leave it. The plan was a desperate 2% operation. Jordan and one of her sisters had spent nights whispering in the shadows, measuring the distance from their bedroom window to the ground. They had managed to conceal a few basic items of clothing and the deactivated phone. On the morning of January 14, 2018, while the vampire schedule had the rest of the house in a deep, malnourished slumber, the two sisters approached the window. The physical act of the escape was a testament to the frailty of their bodies. Jordan, though nearly an adult, possessed the bone density and muscle mass of a small child. Every movement was an agonizing effort. They managed to push the screen out, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stagnant silence of the cul-de-sac. But as they looked down at the pavement, the literal threshold of the world they had been told was a den of monsters. The sister's resolve crumbled. Overwhelmed by a decade of psychological conditioning, she turned back, choosing the familiar chains over the terrifying unknown. Jordan was alone. She dropped from the window, her thin legs absorbing a shock they were never meant to handle. And she began to move. She didn't run. She didn't have the strength for it. She walked, a frantic, stumbling gait that carried her away from the beige walls of her prison. She reached the edge of the neighborhood, her eyes darting toward every shadow. The streetlights felt like spotlights. She was wearing a pair of old dirty sneakers and a thin hoodie, wholly inadequate for the 40 degrees morning air. When she was far enough away that the house was no longer visible, she pulled out the phone. She knew that even a deactivated device could dial 911. Her hands were shaking so violently, she nearly dropped the plastic casing as she pressed the buttons. When the dispatcher answered, the voice on the other end was met with a sound that defied categorization. Jordan didn't sound like a 17-year-old girl. She sounded like a creature from another time. Her speech pattern stunted, her vocabulary limited to the school journals she had been forced to write for years. She told the dispatcher that she had just escaped from home, that she lived in a house with 12 brothers and sisters who were being treated like animals. She explained that some of them were currently chained to their beds. When the dispatcher asked for her address, Jordan went silent. She didn't know it. She had lived in Paris for years, but she had never been allowed to see the numbers on the front of the house. She described the sandcastle sign David had printed. She described the neighborhood, but her sense of geography was a void. For 20 minutes, Jordan remained on the line, shivering in the pre-dawn light until a Riverside County Sheriff's Department patrol car slowed to a crawl beside her. When the deputy stepped out, he didn't see a teenager. He saw a small waif-like figure who appeared to be perhaps 10 or 11 years old. Her skin was a translucent gray. Her hair was matted and thin, and she smelled of the stagnant air of the Muirwood residence. Jordan didn't just have her voice as evidence. She had the phone. She showed the deputy photos she had secretly taken inside the house. The images were a descent into madness. Pictures of her siblings' bruised wrists, shots of the heavy chains and rusted padlocks, and photos of the filth that covered every square inch of the interior. The deputy would later state that the reality of the images was so jarring it felt like a hallucination. Jordan pleaded with him to go back to rescue the others before David and Louise realized she was gone. She was terrified that the principal would find her and bring her back to the darkness. As the sun began to rise over Paris, the silence of the cul-de-sac was about to be shattered by the arrival of a small army. Jordan Turpin had done what 10 years of state oversight and neighborly suspicion had failed to do. She had pierced the veil of the Sandcastle Day School, and for the first time in their lives, her siblings were about to see a different kind of light. When the fleet of patrol cars pulled onto the curb of Muirwood Road, the neighborhood was still tucked beneath the blanket of a Monday morning, the rhythmic ticking of lawn sprinklers, the only sound in the air. The deputies moved with a practiced heavy silence toward the front door of number 112. They expected a confrontation, perhaps a barricade or a desperate father with a weapon, but what they found was a vacuum of emotion. Louise Turpin opened the door, her expression not one of guilt or terror, but of mild, puzzled annoyance. She looked like a woman interrupted during a nap, seemingly incapable of grasping that the perimeter of her kingdom had been breached. The officers stepped across the threshold, and the first thing that hit them wasn't a sight, but a wall of scent, a thick, choking miasma of human filth, stale sweat, and the sharp acidic tang of untreated waste. It was the smell of a prison or a tomb disguised by the floral wallpaper of a suburban home. The interior was a labyrinth of accumulated debris, mountains of unopened boxes, piles of discarded clothing, and trash that reached the waist in some rooms. The flickering blue light of television screens cast long, distorted shadows across the hallway, the only illumination in a house that had long ago declared war on the sun. As they pushed deeper into the Sandcastle Day School, the deputies encountered the students. In the dim light, they saw figures that moved with a terrifying ghost-like fragility. They found children huddled under thin blankets, their skin so pale it appeared almost blue, their eyes wide with a combination of fear and a total lack of comprehension. Then they entered the bedrooms. The clink of metal against metal echoed through the halls as deputies discovered two of the siblings still shackled to their beds with heavy industrial chains and padlocks. The children didn't scream for help. They didn't even move. They simply stared, their bodies having long ago surrendered to the reality of the steel. David Turpin was found in a separate room. He was calm, almost cooperative. He spoke in a soft, monotone voice, the voice of a principal explaining a difficult administrative decision. He told the investigators that he was protecting his children, that the world was too dangerous, and that his methods were necessary for their salvation. He showed no remorse, no realization that the skeletal figures being led out of his house were his own flesh and blood. To David, this wasn't a crime scene. It was a school inspection that had gone off the rails. The medical discovery that followed at the local hospitals would send shockwaves through the global community. As doctors began the intake process, the numbers began to tell a story that the human mind struggled to comprehend. They saw a woman they assumed was a young teenager, only to discover she was 29 years old and weighed barely 82 pounds. They saw a boy they thought was 6 who was actually in his mid-teens. The malnutrition was so profound that several of the siblings suffered from severe cognitive impairment and physical stunting. Their growth plates had fused prematurely. Their internal organs were showing signs of early onset failure, usually seen in the elderly. The investigators spent the next several days combing through the digital and physical archives of the Turpin lives. They found thousands of pages of journals, the homework of the Sandcastle students. The entries were a descent into a shared madness, endless repetitions of praise for David, rambling, incoherent prayers, and desperate pleas for food. There were no records of doctor visits, no dental charts, nothing to indicate that these 13 humans had existed in any official capacity for nearly a decade. The investigation revealed that David and Louise had used the money from David's 6F figuror salary to finance their own lifestyle. Trips to Las Vegas, expensive clothing, and a hoarding habit, while their children were literally being consumed by hunger. The social atmosphere in Paris was one of collective, paralyzing guilt. Neighbors who had lived 20 feet away for years gathered at the yellow police tape, their faces etched with the realization that they had heard nothing, or perhaps that they had heard something and convinced themselves it was a trick of the wind. They spoke of the matching outfits they had seen in the middle of the night, the pale children they had seen searching through trash, and the realization that the strange family at the end of the block had been a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding in plain sight. In the interrogation rooms, the investigators tried to uncover the why. They looked for signs of a wider cult or a charismatic leader who had led the Turpins astray, but they found only a two-person circle of sadism. David and Louise were their own prophets. They had created a faith based on absolute dominion, a religion where the only sacrament was control. They had convinced themselves that by unmaking their children, they were saving them. As the investigation concluded and the trial loomed, the world was left to wonder how a house of horrors could remain so invisible, and how 13 siblings had managed to keep the flame of their humanity alive in a darkness that should have extinguished it years ago. In February 2019, David and Louise Turpin stood in a Riverside County courtroom facing the wreckage of their own design. They pleaded guilty to 14 felony counts, including torture and false imprisonment, avoiding a trial that would have forced their children to recount every minute of their decade-long nightmare. During the sentencing, the atmosphere grew heavy as several of the Turpin siblings stepped forward to deliver victim impact statements. They spoke of the stolen years, the hunger, and the suffocating darkness of the Muirwood residence. One daughter told the court that while life had been a struggle, she was now a fighter, strong and moving ahead. Yet, the psychological complexity of the case was laid bare when another sibling expressed a lingering, gut-wrenching love for their parents, stating they had forgiven them because God loves everyone. David and Louise were both sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. A resolution that finally closed the door on the Sandcastle Day School. Today, the house on Muirwood Road is just another property in a quiet cul-de-sac. The chains are gone, the heavy curtains replaced with glass that finally allows in the light. For the 13 siblings, the journey from the Sandcastle Day School is a slow daily recovery of their own lives. They are learning to navigate a world that was once a forbidden fairy tale, finding the courage to walk, to eat, and to simply exist. Their story remains a stark reminder. The most terrifying monsters don't live in the shadows. They live right next door, hidden behind a beige facade and a polite neighborly wave. It remained April 28, 1988 in the skies above Hawaii. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 had recently departed from Hilo International Airport, heading westward to Honolulu now. It was a brief island-hopping flight, something locals and tourists took every day. The plane, a Boeing 737-200, carried 89 passengers and 5 crew members, including 58-year-old chief flight attendant Clarabelle C.B. Lansing. Clarabelle had served with Aloha Airlines for 37 years. Composed, skilled, and esteemed, she had flown thousands of these short routes. But on this day, a routine trip would turn into one of the most shocking events in aviation history. The plane, registered as N73711, had been operating since 1969, 19 years of service. Due to the constant short flights between islands, it had over 89,000 flight cycles, far more than most jets. Each takeoff and landing caused the fuselage to expand and contract, weakening the metal over time. This process, known as metal fatigue, would shortly reveal itself in a devastating way. In the cockpit were 44-year-old Captain Robert Schornsteimer and 36-year-old First Officer Madeline Mimi Tompkins. Both had thousands of flight hours and were highly experienced. An FAA air traffic controller was additionally on board flying as an observer. Flight 243 took off at 1:25 p.m. beneath clear skies. It had already completed several flights earlier that day with no reported issues. At roughly 1:46 p.m., while cruising at 24,000 feet about 23 miles south of Maui, disaster struck. Without warning, a large section of the fuselage tore open. The roof over the front section of the cabin was torn away, and the plane suddenly depressurized. A thunderous whoosh filled the air as wind and debris tore through the cabin. The cockpit door blew off, and the pilots could view the open sky through what used to be the ceiling. An 18-foot hole now extended from behind the cockpit to the wings. Clarabelle Lansing, standing near row 5 serving drinks, was pulled out of the aircraft immediately. Her remains were never found. A passenger later stated that an attendant had just handed his wife a drink moments before she vanished. 2 other attendants were severely injured. Jane Sato Tomita was struck by debris and lost consciousness, while Michelle Honda was thrown onto the floor by the violent wind. Passengers held onto their seats, viewing the ocean and sky through the torn fuselage. Captain Schornsteimer quickly assumed control from Tompkins, deploying speed brakes and initiating an emergency descent toward Maui's Kahului airport. The aircraft fell more than 4,000 feet per minute. Communication was difficult because of the roaring wind, yet both pilots stayed composed. As they descended below 10,000 feet, the left engine failed, likely from debris damage. They continued on one engine, an uncertain landing gear status. The green indicator showing the nose gear was locked did not illuminate, but they had no option except to land anyway. At 1:58 p.m., just 13 minutes after the explosion, Flight 243 landed on runway 02 at Kahului Airport. The crew used the right engine's thrust reverser to slow the aircraft before coming to a full stop. Emergency slides were deployed and passengers evacuated rapidly. Of the 95 people on board, 65 were injured, including 8 seriously. Clarabelle Lansing was the only fatality. Despite a 3-day Coast Guard search, she was never recovered. The aircraft was heavily damaged and later dismantled. Investigators from the NTSB concluded that metal fatigue and corrosion caused the structural failure. Cracks had developed in the fuselage lap joints, areas where the aircraft skin was bonded. One passenger had even noticed a crack before boarding but failed to report it. Aloha Airlines inspection procedures had missed these warning signs. The NTSB criticized both the airline and the FAA for inadequate oversight, and Boeing for design flaws that trapped moisture and led to corrosion. The accident resulted in new safety regulations under the National Aging Aircraft Research Program. Clarabelle Lansing was remembered for her professionalism and calm demeanor in her final moments. A memorial garden was established for her in 1995 at Honolulu International Airport. Flight 243 remains one of aviation's most remarkable survival stories, a near-impossible mid-air disaster where 94 people returned home alive. Erin Corwin was born on July 15, 1994 in Tennessee. When she was only a few weeks old, she was adopted by a couple from a small town called Oak Ridge. They were deeply faithful people, and after having 2 children of their own, they chose to adopt 4 more, so Erin grew up in a big, tight-knit family. Her parents dedicated all their time to raising the kids, and from the very start they raised them in the church. Erin was reserved and timid by nature. She got along well with her brothers and sisters, but more than anything, she loved being near animals. According to her parents, she had a true talent with them. She trained her cat to follow commands, and while she was still a child, she even succeeded in taming a wild horse. At 14, she got a part-time job at a vet clinic, and for a while, she truly considered building her future around that kind of work. But over time, Erin realized that she couldn't be a veterinarian because she felt too sorry for the animals. As a teenager, she also met a boy named John. They had known each other for several years, and when Erin turned 16, he asked her out after first asking her father for permission. The two of them began dating, and after high school, John proposed. At that point, he was serving in the Marines, and not long after he was assigned to a military base in California. It was on the other side of the country, out in the middle of the desert, and Erin went there with him. The move was a major challenge for her. She was only 19 at the time, and she had never lived away from her parents before. On top of that, it wasn't exactly the simplest place to live. For miles and miles, there was almost nothing but desert, and the temperatures were brutally high most of the time. Even so, Erin tried to adapt to life far from home. At that point, she was still figuring out what she wanted to do with her future. There were barely any job options near the base, but she still found something that felt right for her. About half an hour away, there was a horse rescue ranch, and Erin started going there regularly to help out as a volunteer. On top of that, she and John got 2 dogs and a cat. They were living in a small apartment building, and they quickly got along with the neighbors. Other Marines lived there with their wives and kids, so Erin and John had no trouble finding their own little circle. Little by little, they settled into the new place and started building their own life there. In January 2014, Erin learned she was pregnant, and she and John were overjoyed. But sometime later, she suffered a miscarriage and it struck her hard. Erin became more withdrawn, depressed, and in general started distancing herself from people around her. Still, about 6 months later, in late June, she got pregnant again. By the time Erin found out, she was already 3 months along with that happy news. And with her 20th birthday just a few weeks away, her mother decided to fly out to California to visit her. Erin was really looking forward to it. On June 28th, a few days before her mother was supposed to arrive, Erin told John she was going to head into the national park near the base. She wanted to check out a few interesting spots she might be able to show her mom. So, she got up early that morning, got in the car, and drove off. She said she'd be back around 4:00 p.m., but the hours passed and Erin still hadn't come home. John tried calling her, but her phone was off. He waited all night, and when she still hadn't shown up by morning, he finally called the police. After hearing his story, officers considered the possibility that Erin had become lost in the national park, or that something else had gone wrong out there. It was harsh terrain with extreme heat and huge stretches of empty desert. So, police couldn't dismiss the idea that a young woman on her own had simply underestimated what she was dealing with. Police ended up sending officers out to search the national park, while they stayed back and started interviewing the people who knew Erin, hoping to get some extra information. One thing immediately struck them as odd. John hadn't reported his wife missing until the next day. For a missing person, especially in a place like that, those lost hours were critical. To the officers, it almost looked like he wasn't all that concerned about the possibility that Erin had spent the entire night out in the desert. Police spoke to the couple's neighbors who were close with Erin and Jean, and pretty quickly, detectives heard something interesting. A woman named Icing, who had been friends with Erin, told them that Erin had been having an affair with her neighbor, a man named Chris. According to her, the two of them had started secretly seeing each other earlier that year. After Erin lost the baby, things between her and John had clearly gotten worse. She had started pulling away from him and in general became much more withdrawn and depressed. At some point, she also began spending a lot of money on online shopping because for a while it made her feel better, but that only created more problems. Since Erin wasn't working and they were living off John's income, money was already limited and all that spending led to serious credit card debt. In the end, John took all of Erin's bank cards away. That left her feeling trapped and powerless in her own home, which only made their relationship worse. Meanwhile, Erin started spending more and more time with her neighbor Chris. He was a Marine too, and he often went out to the horse ranch with her. Chris was married and had a daughter, but that didn't stop him from starting an affair with Erin. For a while they managed to keep it quiet, but Chris's wife found out pretty quickly. And after that, so did the rest of the people around them. She told John, but he didn't end the marriage. Instead, he decided to try to save it. So naturally, police started wondering whether John might have grown bitter toward his wife and decided to get rid of her. At the same time, they were also considering another possibility, Chris's involvement. That idea came from the fact that his account of events was very different from what everyone else had been telling them. When police first questioned him, Chris said he barely knew Erin, and that their relationship went no further than occasionally saying hi out on the street. But now the detectives knew about the affair. That answer sounded highly suspicious. Even so, police weren't rushing to accuse him of being involved in Erin's disappearance. Chris could have simply been trying to protect his career in the Marines. An affair like that could easily have led to serious consequences, or even gotten him kicked out. But before long, detectives uncovered something else. After speaking with Erin's best friend back in her hometown, they learned that the affair with Chris hadn't actually ended after it was exposed, or rather it had stopped for a while. But then the two of them started seeing each other again. This time they were much more careful about hiding it, but Erin had mentioned it more than once in messages to her best friend. Erin said she wanted to leave John and move to Alaska with Chris. After she found out she was pregnant, she told both her friend and Chris that the baby might be his. Chris reacted positively, but there was one major problem. He already had a wife and daughter. Because of that, he asked Erin not to tell anyone she was pregnant and to give him time to figure out what to do. But keeping it secret didn't work out. Just a few days before Erin disappeared, she started feeling unwell, and John took her to the hospital. That's where doctors discovered she was pregnant and talked about it to both her and her husband. So now John knew about the pregnancy, and detectives started wondering, did he also know that Erin had continued seeing Chris in secret? If he did, he could have easily started thinking the baby wasn't his, especially considering how far along she was, and the fact that he and Erin had already been having serious problems in their marriage. Police considered the possibility that John may have done something to his wife out of anger. But there was another theory too. Could Chris have hurt Erin in order to keep her quiet? Police questioned Chris again, but he kept insisting they had never been intimate. and that there was no way Erin could have been pregnant by him. Since Erin had told her best friend the exact opposite, detectives weren't ready to just take his word for it. But at that point, they had no proof he was lying. At the same time, police intensified the search for Erin, and eventually it paid off. They found her car parked on the outskirts of town out in an empty, desolate area. No one was inside, but a set of women's boot prints led away from the vehicle for several yards, then suddenly stopped. In that spot, investigators found tire tracks from another car, and detectives came to the conclusion that Erin had gotten into someone else's vehicle and been driven away to an unknown location. While crime scene techs processed the area more thoroughly, detectives uncovered something else. When Jessie, Erin's best friend from back home, heard that police were starting to suspect Chris, she immediately told them Erin had been planning to meet him on the day she disappeared. According to Jessie, Erin had messaged her saying Chris had asked her to meet him out in that same national park so they could talk about the relationship and her pregnancy, and that he had some kind of surprise for her. Erin thought he might be planning to propose, and she had been genuinely excited about the meeting. The only thing she couldn't understand was why Chris wanted to meet in the middle of nowhere. But that wasn't all. Detectives spoke to Isel again, and this time she shared something interesting. The day before Erin disappeared, Chris had told Iseling's husband that he was planning to head out into the desert the next morning to hunt coyotes, and even invited him to come along, but the man backed out at the last minute. Even so, he had noticed a propane tank in Chris's vehicle and asked why he was bringing that along on a hunting trip. Chris replied that he just wanted to blow up some abandoned mine shaft, and there were plenty of those scattered around the area. It sounded strange, but at the time his friend didn't think much of it. After that, Chris drove out into the desert, and a few hours later, his friend texted to say he had become free earlier than expected and could still join him. Chris sent him his location, but then for some reason, he switched his phone to airplane mode. His friend couldn't find him at the coordinates he'd been sent, and he couldn't reach him by phone either. He looked for him for hours, then eventually gave up and left. Chris didn't turn airplane mode off until around 3:30 that afternoon, and then went back to the base. When his friend asked where he disappeared to, Chris said he'd gotten lost in the desert. According to him, he never found any coyotes, so he just ended up shooting at some rocks. His friend also asked why he had put his phone in airplane mode, and Chris said he was trying to save battery. Finally, the friend noticed that the propane tank was no longer in the vehicle. He asked whether Chris had managed to blow up the mine, but Chris replied that things hadn't gone the way he had planned. At that point, detectives were almost certain Chris had met up with Erin that day, but they still didn't have solid proof that he actually harmed her. On top of that, they still weren't ready to cross her husband off the suspect list either. Police couldn't rule out the possibility that John had followed his wife, discovered she was meeting her lover, and then killed her. Detectives got a warrant to search Erin and John's apartment, but they didn't find anything there that pointed to her husband. When they looked through Erin's computer, they found open tabs with rental listings in Alaska, in Chris's hometown. They also found a handwritten poem Chris had written to Erin. Later, one of Erin's friends explained that he had given it to her not long after his wife found out about the affair, and that it was after that the two of them started seeing each other again. Police brought Chris in again, but he stuck to his original story. He kept telling detectives that his relationship with Erin had never been serious, and that there had never been any physical intimacy between them. Chris also said he hadn't seen Erin on the day she disappeared. According to him, he had simply gone hunting, but never found any coyotes and ended up getting lost. He said that at one point he saw a strange man in the distance who pointed a gun at him. Chris claimed he fired several shots in the man's direction, then drove away. When police asked why he never reported this armed stranger, Chris said that he had been outside cell service, and that was the moment detectives caught something important. He said, even though by his own account of events, he had been out there alone. Everything they had learned was making detectives seriously doubt his honesty. But they still didn't know where Erin was or what had happened to her. By that point, experts had already compared the tire tracks found near Erin's car to the tires on Chris's vehicle, the one he had driven into the desert that day. They looked very similar, but it was hard to say it was a 100% match. Even so, detectives used that during the interview, but Chris kept insisting he had never met up with Erin that day. At one point, he slightly changed his story and said that he had seen Erin's car, but Erin herself wasn't inside. When asked why he had hidden that information, Chris said he didn't want people thinking he and Aaron started sneaking around together again. After that, police told him they had statements from Aaron's best friend, saying that not only had the affair started back up, but the two of them had planned to meet up on the day she disappeared. Chris responded by saying Aaron had simply lied to her friend and that she was a pathological liar. He claimed she had told people that her husband hit her, even though, according to him, that wasn't true, and that she lied about plenty of other things too. At the end of the interview, Chris agreed to give fingerprints and a DNA sample, and then he was released. After that, detectives got a warrant to search his house and discovered that the rifle he had taken hunting that day was missing. When they questioned Chris about it, they learned that for some reason his wife had taken that rifle to the ranch where he and Aaron had spent a lot of time. Detectives drove there with his wife to recover the weapon, and that's when they encountered another interesting twist. The rifle was inside the ranch owner's house, but the woman said she had absolutely no idea Chris's wife had come by and left a gun there. As for the search of Chris's own home, police didn't find any evidence tying him to Aaron's disappearance. Even so, during all of that, detectives found a homemade device, basically a kind of cannon for launching potatoes that worked by igniting gas. Police considered that device illegal under state law, so they arrested Chris. Since investigators still couldn't tie him directly to Aaron's disappearance, the cannon gave them a convenient reason to take him into custody. But his wife quickly posted bail, and they had to let him go. That same week, Chris's military contract ended. Not long after that, he left his wife and child and went back home to Alaska. For detectives, that became a serious challenge. More than a week had already passed since Aaron disappeared, and everyone understood that the chances of finding her alive were almost gone. Now that Chris had left for another state, police had no real option but to throw all their effort into the search. At that point, information about the suspicions surrounding Chris still hadn't spread widely in the media, so a lot of people continued to believe Aaron's husband was the one responsible. John was still serving on the base, but because of everything that was happening, his superiors decided to move him to a warehouse duty for the time being, worried that the situation could seriously affect his mental state. The search for Aaron continued day after day, but nothing was turning up. Because Chris had told his friend he wanted to blow up an abandoned mine shaft, police started considering the possibility that Aaron's body had been hidden in one of those places. But there were two major problems. First, there were countless abandoned mine shafts scattered throughout the desert. And second, checking them wasn't easy at all. Many of them were extremely hard to access, which meant police simply couldn't examine what was inside. Even so, the search continued every single day because investigators had no other real chance of getting justice in this case. They brought in rescue teams and volunteers who spent weeks combing through the desert looking for Aaron. Because the area was so remote, many of the people involved in the search ended up sleeping in their cars just to avoid wasting time driving back and forth to town. On top of that, they were forced to work in unbearable heat, which made everything even harder. That went on for more than a month, and during that time, police checked hundreds of mine shafts. But Aaron still wasn't found. By then, detectives had completely crossed John off the suspect list because there was no evidence that he had left the military base that day. Once that information made its way into the media and reporters started writing about police suspicions surrounding Chris, one of his fellow Marines came forward with a fairly interesting story. According to him, not long before all this happened, Chris had talked to him about how to hide a human body so it would never be found. Another acquaintance of Chris told detectives that just a few days before Aaron disappeared, the two of them had gone out into the desert to look at abandoned mine shafts, and he even showed police the photos they had taken that day. Detectives immediately brought in a local expert on those mines and showed him the pictures. After studying them, he gave police several possible locations where those shafts might be, and detectives focused their search on those areas. Even then, there were still hundreds of hard-to-reach mine shafts out there, and the search team still couldn't find Aaron. About a month and a half after she disappeared, the sheriff's department announced that they can no longer keep pouring manpower and resources into the search, and that the operation would be called off after August 16th. Investigators understood that if that happened, they would have almost no chance of ever holding Chris accountable. But they simply had no other choice. On that day, one member of the search team was checking another stretch of desert when he came across yet another mine shaft. But this time, something immediately felt different. A strong smell of gas was coming up from inside, mixed with another odor that smelled like decomposition. He immediately reported it, and the team started trying to figure out how to look inside. The shaft was difficult to access, and because of gas, police couldn't just send someone down there. So they built a makeshift device with a camera and a battery that they hoped they could lower into the shaft and use it to see what was inside. But the bottom wasn't directly under the opening. It was off to one side, so they still couldn't get the camera down far enough. At that point, they brought in oxygen tanks and sent a volunteer down. He managed to descend about 20 feet, but at that depth, the gas detector started going off hard, warning that the air was dangerous. On top of that, he said he could actually smell the gas even through the oxygen mask. Because of that, he couldn't make it all the way to the bottom, but he took that same camera and lowered it down the slope inside the shaft, which finally gave him a view of the bottom. The image wasn't clear enough to be certain, but to him, it looked like there was a human body down there. And that wasn't all. There also appeared to be a white propane tank and a car tire. After that, police brought in a specialist with more advanced equipment, and he managed to go down deeper. This time, he got a much clearer look at the bottom of the shaft, and detectives could now clearly see a human body. Right after that, they called in the fire department, and firefighters organized an operation to bring the body back up to the surface. It turned out to be extremely difficult because of how hard the shaft was to reach, but in the end they managed to do it. The body was in advanced state of decomposition, so there was no way to identify the victim by sight. The only thing detectives noticed right away was a rope around the neck with two handles tied to the ends, making it look like a homemade garrote. On top of that, they found a white propane tank near the body, several spent shell casings, a blue climbing rope, a piece of rebar, and two mugs marked property of the US government. There was also a stick with a rag wrapped around it, which looked like an unlit homemade torch. Not long after, medical examiners confirmed that the victim was Aaron using her dental records. Because of the advanced decomposition, they couldn't determine the exact cause of death, but they did find multiple fractures. Some of those could have happened when she fell into the mine shaft, but one injury stood out from the rest. The back of her skull was broken in a way that looked like she'd been struck in the head. On top of that, the rope around her neck suggested Aaron may have died from strangulation. Detectives also noted one more unusual detail. Aaron's purse, phone, shoes, wedding ring, and keys were never found. That suggested the killer may have discarded them somewhere else. From the very first moment the body was discovered, detectives made the decision to keep that information secret so they wouldn't scare Chris off. At that point, he was still living in Alaska, and in theory, he could have easily disappeared if he wanted to. So, police told only Aaron's parents and asked them not to say anything until Chris had been arrested. After that, they contacted law enforcement in Alaska, and Chris was taken into custody there before being extradited back to California. Now that detectives had much more evidence against him, Chris's involvement in Aaron's murder looked almost undeniable. The propane tank found in the mine matched the description of the one he'd had with him on the day she disappeared. Investigators also found the exact same kind of blue climbing rope in his vehicle. And under the passenger seat, they discovered a homemade garrote that looked just like the one used to strangle Aaron. Even with all of that pointing to him, Chris kept denying he had anything to do with the murder, and the case moved to trial. Later, experts re-examined the items recovered from the mine and found Chris's DNA on two of them, which only made the case against him even stronger. The trial began on October 2016, and all through those 2 years, Chris kept insisting he was innocent. The prosecution laid out all the evidence they had, calling a long list of witnesses, and overall, things were looking very bad for him. But then on October 27th, he managed to shock everyone. Karis took the stand and suddenly admitted that he had killed Aaron, but according to him, it hadn't happened the way it seemed. He claimed that the two of them had driven out into the desert that morning. Supposedly, a few friends had originally been planning to go, too, but they backed out at the last minute, so Chris ended up alone there with Aaron. According to his account, Aaron started telling him she wanted to leave everything behind and move to Alaska with him. She also said that she loved him and his daughter, and that was when the entire courtroom was hit with something bizarre. Chris suddenly claimed that Aaron had done something inappropriate to his daughter. He said Aaron had watched the girl on multiple occasions while he and his wife were busy, and that after one of those times, they started to suspect she had done something disturbing to their daughter. Now, according to Chris, while they were out there in the desert and Aaron said she loved his daughter, he was suddenly reminded of that incident and started accusing her. He claimed Aaron admitted that she really had done it, and he snapped. He pulled out a homemade strangulation device, which just happened to be in his pocket, and attacked her. After realizing she was dead, he panicked and decided to dump her body in the mine shaft. Of course, no one in the courtroom was quick to buy that story for several reasons. First of all, those were incredibly serious accusations against Aaron, and yet neither Chris nor his wife had ever gone to the police. More than that, they had continued leaving their daughter alone with Aaron, and Chris had even resumed the affair afterward. Second, the story itself made almost no sense. Chris claimed he had ended up alone with Aaron in the desert purely by chance because their friends backed out at the last second. But all the evidence and witness testimony pointed to something very different, that he had invited her there specifically to talk about their relationship. And then there was the strangulation device. Chris just happened to have a homemade garrote in his pocket, a tool with basically one purpose: to strangle someone. So his sudden confession didn't create sympathy. It created disgust, doubt, and outrage. Even his own mother, who had stood by him the entire time, got up and walked out of the courtroom when she heard her son's version of events, and she never came back. To everyone listening, the accusations against Aaron sounded less like the truth and more like a desperate attempt to get a lighter sentence. The prosecution presented a far more convincing version of what happened. In their view, Chris had never seen his affair with Aaron as anything serious. He had no intention of leaving his wife, and he was afraid that if they divorced, she would limit access to their daughter, especially once the affair came out. When Chris learned that Aaron might be pregnant by him, he realized his wife would likely file for divorce the moment that became public. So he decided to get rid of Aaron, lured her into the desert, strangled her, dumped her body in the mine shaft, and then tried to destroy the evidence with gas and a torch. But something went wrong. That version made far more sense to the jury. It took them only an hour and a half to reach a unanimous verdict. Chris was guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. One more detail is worth mentioning. By the time Aaron's body was found, the level of decomposition was too advanced to recover DNA from the baby and determine paternity. So to this day, no one knows for sure whose child she was carrying. Her blog fell silent on May 10, 2009. Her flowers were withering in the garden. Her dogs were barking with nobody to feed them, and her husband had a very simple explanation for all of it. She left. No one believed him, but for years that was all anyone had. Marcia Ellen Brantley was a writer. Not a famous one, not yet, but a genuine one. She belonged to a writers group in Cleveland, Tennessee that she herself had established in 2007, a small gathering of women who shared pages and trusted each other with their drafts. They called themselves, half-jokingly, the Big Girl Panties Group. Marcia called it her lifeline. She was 50 years old when she disappeared. She had light brown hair and blue eyes and stood nearly 5'10" in. She had spent years working at Lee University as director of commuter services, and those who worked alongside her described her as intelligent, kind, and exceptionally good at her job. But by 2009, she had left that position to write full-time, supported by an inheritance from her parents, the only two people, it seemed, who had grounded her world. Both of Marcia's parents died within weeks of each other in late 2000, both from cancer. The tragedy shattered her. Friends said she never completely recovered from it. She used part of the inheritance to finance a franchise handyman business for her husband. She devoted another portion to simply endure the grief. She had earned second place in Writer's Digest short story competition, selected from nearly 7,000 entries, with a piece called Dirty Little Secrets. She maintained a personal blog called The Magpie's Nest. She volunteered at an animal shelter. She adored her 3 dogs the way some people cherish children. She was, by every account, someone whose presence was unmistakable and whose absence would be noticed immediately. Except, as it turned out, it wasn't. Not for months. Marcia met Donnie Ray Brantley in 1999 through an online dating website, a relatively new concept at the time. He was divorced, the father of a teenage daughter named Elise. He was a competitive cyclist, outdoorsy, apparently grounded. They married on March 28, 2000, and moved into the Cleveland home that Marcia's parents had built for her. In the early years, the marriage seemed functional. Donnie established a handyman franchise business, and Marcia invested substantial money from her inheritance into supporting it. But by 2008 and 2009, the business was collapsing. According to investigators, the franchise was depleting Marcia's inherited funds. The funds her parents had left behind, the thing that was meant to guarantee her future, were vanishing. Those who knew Marcia noticed changes in her. At her last hair appointment in April 2009, her hairdresser, Kelly Dude, who had been styling Marcia's hair since 2000, observed that she had lost a noticeable amount of weight and seemed to be facing financial difficulties. Her compounding pharmacist, who had been overseeing her hormone replacement therapy since 2004, documented in chart notes dated May 1, 2009, that Marcia had been off her hormones since April 12th and was experiencing, in the pharmacist's own underlined words, severe depression. In March 2009, she had told her writer group she was so depressed she couldn't get off the couch. One of the members, Reggie J., said she sent the group a resentful email a few months before her disappearance, saying she would be absent for some time with no further explanation. Reggie's first thought, she later said, was not that Marcia needed space. Her first thought was, did Donnie write that? Marcia's blog, The Magpie's Nest, was updated for the final time on May 10, 2009. It was a cheerful entry, deceptively so. She wrote about going to see the new Star Trek film with Donnie the night before. The word "wow" was in the post, followed by an exclamation point. It read like the entry of someone who was doing fine. Her second-to-last post from March 31, 2009, their 9th wedding anniversary, was a tribute to Donnie. She called him someone she loved more than she ever imagined possible. She wrote about their life together with affection. The final time anyone outside the home heard Marcia's voice was May 27, 2009, when she called her best friend Kim Shank in Ohio. Then silence. No further calls, no more blog posts, no emails, no communication of any kind with family, friends, or her writers group. Her aunt, Medra Justice, lived in North Carolina. Her cousin, Jana Wills, lived in Illinois. Marcia had no siblings, no children. Her parents were gone. The people who might have noticed her absence first were dispersed, geographically. And the person who lived with her every day said she had simply departed. Donnie told a neighbor who asked about the quiet house and the neglected dogs that Marcia had gone out west. He offered no additional details. The flowers in the garden continued to wither. The dogs continued to bark, and Donnie Brantley carried on with his life. That phone call on May 27th would be the final time anyone heard from her. It was not the police who first raised the alarm about Marcia Brantley. It was not her family scattered across state lines and unaware. It was not a neighbor or a coworker or someone from her church. It was her hairdresser. Kelly Dude had been trimming and coloring Marcia's hair for nearly a decade on a 6-week schedule without exception. When Marcia missed her appointment after April 2009 and did not rebook, Delude started calling. Marcia's phone went to voicemail. The number for Donnie's handyman business was disconnected. Delude contacted the Cleveland Police Department. The response she received was dismissive. The officer she spoke with told her in effect that if Donnie said his wife had left him, then she had left him. Delude was not a relative. There was nothing the department could do. She did not quit. While cutting the hair of a local attorney named Jerry Hoffer, Dude mentioned the situation. Hoffer walked directly to the district attorney's office and said plainly, "You've got a dead lady out there. You all need to be looking for her." DA investigator Walt Hunt interviewed Donnie Brantley. He later described Donnie as a bit cooler than I might expect from a man whose wife had supposedly abandoned him. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation became involved. But despite the interview and despite the mounting unease among those who knew Marcia, the official missing person report was not submitted until November 2009, nearly 6 months after she vanished. 6 months. The thought of it is difficult to accept. While investigators were still in their initial stages, Donnie Brantley had already begun moving forward. Within hours of his first interview with DA investigator Walt Hunt, Donnie went to a pawn shop. He pawned Marcia's jewelry, her 14-karat gold cross, her figuro necklace, her figuro bracelet, herringbone necklace. He also pawned her Toshiba laptop on the morning of June 3, 2009. Within roughly 24 hours of the last recorded activity on Marcia's cell phone, Donnie personally delivered a greeting card to a woman named Stephanie Richardson, an ex-girlfriend. The card read, "Hi girl, things are better for me now. Call me if you can." He included his phone number. Phone records showed that Marcia's cell phone had, in the days after her disappearance, been used to dial the Chattanooga Singles dating service. Marcia had not used it. The phone never traveled more than 2 miles from their home. On June 2, 2009, it went permanently silent. Donnie's story about his wife changed repeatedly. At various points, he told people she'd gone to Florida, then that she'd gone out west to work as a missionary, then that she was camping in Towns End, Tennessee, then that she had moved away in a camper. Each story contradicted the last. None of them were true. At one point, he told investigators Marsha's car was parked at a local Walmart. The first time police checked, it wasn't there. The second time it was. Walmart staff had never heard of her. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was chilling. In November 2012, 3 years after Marsha vanished, a court transferred custody of the Brantley home to Marsha's family. Investigators and the family's attorney were finally able to examine it in detail. What they found was unsettling in its own quiet way. Every photograph of Marsha had been taken from the walls. Her remaining belongings had been packed into garbage bags. Her day planner, still inside the house, helped investigators determine early June 2009 as the most likely date of her disappearance. Sections of the basement floor were excavated. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Nothing was found. No blood, no remains, no crime scene, no evidence that any violence had occurred on that property at all. But investigators did find something else. Receipts for duct tape, for plastic sheeting, for a torch and welder kit purchased near the time Marsha went missing. District Attorney Steve Crump would later describe these receipts as preparations for disposing of Marsha Brantley. The defense countered that Donnie ran a home repair business. The materials could have been work supplies. Also that year, Marsha's recreational vehicle, long missing, was located on land owned by Donnie's family. It had been concealed there. Donnie was charged with hindering a secured creditor. It was a minor charge, but it confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Donnie Brantley was hiding things. In March 2010, Donnie Brantley voluntarily agreed to take a polygraph examination. According to Detective Zach Pike of the Bradley County Sheriff's Office, he failed it, and not narrowly. Pike described it later as failing with flying colors. Investigators had by this point built a portrait of a man whose behavior defied any innocent explanation. He had offered changing versions of his wife's whereabouts. He had pawned her jewelry the very day he was initially questioned. He had contacted an ex-girlfriend within 24 hours of Marsha's phone falling silent. He had hidden her RV on his family's property. He had utilized her cell phone after she vanished. And yet there was no body, no crime scene, no forensic evidence, no witness, no confession. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Bradley County Sheriff's Office continued investigating the case. In October 2011, the Sheriff's Office officially entered the investigation. Detective Pike later said there were many nights he had gone without sleep wondering where Marsha was. In 2013, a civil wrongful death lawsuit was filed by Marsha's family. Donnie was deposed. Throughout that deposition, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination more than 100 times. He could not remember or would not respond whether he had maintained extramarital relationships during the marriage. He would not respond whether his actions had anything to do with her disappearance. He said nothing that assisted, and everything he declined to say spoke for itself. In July 2013, a Bradley County grand jury indicted Donnie Ray Brantley on 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder. He was arrested in August of that year when he appeared at the courthouse on the unrelated creditor charge. Bond was set at $500,000. Marsha's aunt, Medra Justice, told reporters she welcomed the charges. She said, "Donnie Brantley is going to answer for what he's done to her." Her cousin, Jana Wills, requested only that the family's sorrow be recognized. "Our family has a hole there that can't be replaced, and we will do everything we can to find her, and we won't give up." But in May 2014, the charges were dropped. The prosecutors and the family reached the decision together. They believed they did not yet possess enough for a conviction. And as one official remarked, "You only get one shot." They wanted to be certain before they went to trial. DA Steve Crump, newly elected, transferred the case to a cold case unit and continued digging. In October 2016, Donnie, by then residing in Carterville, Georgia, was arrested by U.S. Marshals. He was re-indicted on December 13, 2016. Bond was set at $250,000. A trial date was scheduled for February 5, 2018. The family clung to hope. Medra Justice posted on Facebook in the days before trial asking for prayers. She wrote that she believed Donnie would be found guilty, and that whatever the outcome, she wanted the truth to emerge. Her deepest wish was simply to locate Marsha and lay her to rest. And then on the morning of February 5, 2018, before a single witness took the stand, Crump moved to dismiss. The truth was about to emerge, and it was worse than anyone imagined. Defense attorney Lee Davis had submitted a memorandum raising a territorial jurisdiction challenge. Under Tennessee law, prosecutors must demonstrate not only that a crime occurred, but that it happened within the county bringing the charges. Davis argued they could not prove that Marcia had been killed in Bradley County. A recent unfavorable ruling in a neighboring county suggested that Judge Andrew Freiberg might grant a directed acquittal, the equivalent of a not guilty verdict, if the case reached trial without that proof. A directed acquittal under Tennessee's Rule 29 would mean no retrial ever. Double jeopardy would attach. The case would be finished permanently. Crump made the decision. He stood before Judge Freiberg and spoke the words that had haunted this case from the beginning. In this unusual case, the state has no proof of a crime. No body, no crime scene, and no forensic evidence of any kind. There are no witnesses to a crime, no confessions. Judge Freiberg dismissed the charges without prejudice. He turned toward Donnie Brantley and said, "You are free to go." Donnie stepped outside the courthouse and told reporters he was thankful for the dismissal. He said he looked forward to leaving this difficult time behind him. Crump, for his part, was not finished. He told media directly, "He murdered her. And then I've been very plain that we're not going to stop. And so whatever he feels, relief or whatever he may experience, I wouldn't get accustomed to it." Donnie's record of charges in Bradley County was subsequently expunged. His daughter, Elise, who had remained beside him throughout, said that she knew the inside of her father's heart and that he would never harm anyone. She said she had never even asked him if he killed Marcia because she already knew he hadn't. The silence in the room for the people who loved Marcia Brantley was louder than any scream. Marcia Brantley's remains have never been recovered. There is no grave, no burial, no place where a family can stand and say goodbye. She was declared legally deceased in civil court. She is still listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System as a missing person. Those two things are not contradictions. They are the form of this case. Charges can be refiled if new evidence emerges. As of today, no third indictment has been filed. Everyone who loved her, her aunt, her cousin, her best friend, her hairdresser, the detectives who spent years on her case, believe she was killed by her husband, and they believe he has remained free ever since. Detective Zach Pike said there were many nights he was unable to sleep, wondering where Marcia was. Kelly Dude, the hairdresser who began all of this, said simply, "He's hidden her body very well. I know that." The defense's position, argued by Lee Davis from the beginning, was that Marcia Brantley was a deeply depressed woman who may have taken $100,000 to $110 in cash from a stash in the attic and simply walked away from her life. Perhaps to vanish voluntarily, perhaps to end it somewhere else, quietly and alone. If you have any information about the disappearance of Marcia Brantley, the Bradley County Sheriff's Office tip line is 423-728-7336. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation can be reached at 1-800-TBI-FIND. Marcia Brantley loved words. She believed stories held power. She believed the truth, if you told it clearly enough, could change things. Somewhere her story is still waiting to be completed. Shauna Ann Castleton was born on March 13, 1966 in Salt Lake City, Utah. During a childhood, she was known for being cheerful, kind, and creative. She enjoyed sketching blooms, she enjoyed books. She was raised in a faith-centered home. Moreover, the individuals who recalled her earlier years portrayed her the same manner individuals would depict her decades later: warm, outgoing, and lively. When she was about 12 years old, her family relocated to Broomall, Pennsylvania. A few years later, they relocated again, that time to Northern Virginia, where Shauna spent her adolescent years. She was a cheerleader. She had many of friends. She was the type of individual who made others feel relaxed swiftly. Then in 1994, at 28 years old, she executed a significant move. She abandoned that life behind and moved to Las Vegas. And differently than many of individuals who come in Las Vegas pursuing a dream and lose themselves in the city, Shauna constructed a life there. She initially worked retailing beauty at Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus. Subsequently, she transitioned into casino hospitality and became a drink server at the Fiesta. Then in 2001, when the Palms opened, Shauna was present from the very beginning. That position became a major portion of her life. Colleagues characterized her as energetic, fashionable, diligent, and remarkable. She remembered loyal clients. She prepared muffins for birthdays. She had the type of personality that made individuals feel as if they knew her, even if they had only met her once. By every account, she was proficient in her work and skilled with individuals. Within a metropolis built upon appearances and dealings, Shauna still appeared as authentic. During 2002, whilst employed at the Palms, she encountered George Miguel TFA. On initial glance, George appeared like the type of man individuals believed immediately. He had been his high school valedictorian. He graduated from West Point in 1994. He served in the Army Corps of Engineers. Subsequently, he became a Las Vegas firefighter. He was disciplined, achieved, respected, and seemingly stable. For the individuals surrounding them, they appeared like a solid pairing. Roughly a year into their relationship, they welcomed their daughter, Maddie, and from that moment onward, Shauna's existence centered around her. Friends and family would later state that Maddie was the core of Shauna's world. Everything she did, every decision she made, every plan she had for the future returned to her daughter. On March 16, 2006, Shauna and George were wed in Hawaii. For a while, they appeared like the image of a hard-working Las Vegas family, a firefighter, a casino cocktail waitress, a daughter they adored, a life in Summerland, and what appeared from the exterior like a stable marriage. Yet the account people witnessed from the outside was not the complete story. According to individuals close to Shauna, matters began to shift after a pair of joyful years. Monetary strain struck the family, especially after the housing crash, and George, they stated, became harsher, more controlling, more suspicious, more critical. Friends and relatives later stated he was jealous of Shauna's occupation, uneasy with how she dressed for work, and increasingly harsh in ways that left emotional harm behind closed doors. These were accounts from her sister and individuals close to her, not official court findings of abuse, but they were steady enough to form a pattern. By late 2011, the marriage was in severe trouble. In December 2011, George officially started divorce proceedings. By that time, the couple had separate bank accounts, continuing disputes over money, and a family court process that threatened George financially. Evidence later presented in court indicated he was deeply dissatisfied about the prospect of having to pay Shauna money and surrender assets tied to his family. At the same moment, another individual was growing more significant in George's life. His name was Noel Scott Stevens. Stevens was not a polished acquaintance or colleague. He was a homeless handyman with a violent criminal past. He had prior felonies. He had drug-related problems. He lived on the margins and moved through life with the instability of someone who had long since fallen out of the normal structure most people rely on. And yet George kept him close. In early 2012, after Stephen stabbed his own nephew and injured his hand, George reportedly treated that wound and allowed him to stay at the family residence for a short period. Shauna despised it. She found Stevens unsettling. She did not want him near. She even threatened to contact police because she believed he was selling drugs. Eventually, Stevens left the residence and went to camp in the desert nearby. But George did not distance himself from him. If anything, the connection grew stronger. Stevens had access to George's house. He kept belongings there. He showered there. He stayed in constant contact with George. What may have appeared to outsiders as compassion or generosity was, according to prosecutors, turning into something much darker. By spring of 2012, Shauna had moved into her own apartment. By summer, the couple had sold their shared home and were living apart. They shared custody of Maddie. They were also attending marriage counseling because Shauna still had hope. That part matters. She was not emotionally detached. She was still trying. People close to her said she wanted the family to succeed. She wanted her daughter to have a stable home. She wanted to believe things could get better. She was sad, yes, but not surrendered. She was trying to manage separation, co-parenting, and the collapse of the life she believed she had built. While Shauna was trying to preserve something, George, according to later court evidence, was moving in a very different direction. By late summer of 2012, prosecutors said George had approached Noel Stevens with an offer: kill Shauna. At first, Stevens said George offered him $1,000. Stevens later stated he did not take that seriously. Then the amount increased to $5,000. That, he said, altered things. From there, the situation stopped resembling marital breakdown and began resembling an operation. The two men discussed approaches. One idea involved staging a collision. Another involved a zip tie. Eventually, they concentrated on hammers. That detail is one of the most unsettling parts of this case because it suggests not anger but planning. According to later trial evidence, Stevens wanted a heavier hammer. George allegedly advised him against it, saying a lighter hammer would swing quicker and be less likely to break. They purchased multiple hammers, mostly with cash. George allegedly even warned Stevens not to use the one bought with George's own credit card. That is not the wording of a man acting emotionally. That is the wording of someone organizing evidence before the crime has even occurred. George also gave Stevens information that made the attack feasible. Shauna's work schedule, a map showing where she parked at the Palms, directions to her apartment, and most importantly, a key. By then, Stevens did not need chance, he needed timing. And in early September 2012, he made his first attempt. He went to the Palms planning to attack Shauna after work. But there were police officers nearby because of a concert, so he withdrew. A few days later, there was another attempt. Surveillance cameras recorded George and Stevens together purchasing dark clothing, gloves, a knife, and additional items using cash. That same night, Stevens went out again intending to execute the killing, but he was arrested before he could carry it out. Police recovered a hammer, gloves, a knife, and a modified beanie. Even that did not halt the scheme. After his release, Stevens reached out to George again. Then came another attempt. This time, Stevens obtained a different hammer and waited near Shauna's apartment, lying in wait, but a police helicopter swept the zone with its beam and he fled. He discarded the hammer and vanished into the night. 3 attempts, 3 opportunities for the plan to collapse. 3 times it continued. And throughout this, Shauna kept living what she believed was a difficult but manageable reality. Work, parenting, counseling, separation, concern, hope. Then something occurred that clearly unsettled her. In early September, her apartment was broken into. Her wedding ring was stolen. Other belongings were disturbed. A strange piece of women's underwear was found inside. She texted George a photo of it, asking if someone had entered her place. She was unsettled. Her family later said the break-in disturbed her. What she did not know was that prosecutors believed the intruder was Noel Stevens inside with the key George had given him. So by the time Shauna sensed something was wrong, the person violating her privacy was already within the circle of trust around her life. Then came September 28, 2012. That day, Shauna received a new garage door opener. A normal detail, a routine detail, the kind of thing no one recalls unless they are planning a murder. According to the later court record, George passed that information to Stevens. He also told him Shauna was not home. Stevens entered the apartment again. This time, he did more than enter. He prepared. He relocated jewelry, purses, and other items into a downstairs closet so that after the murder, he could take them and stage the scene as a robbery. He was not improvising anymore. He was constructing a set. That evening, George had a call with Shauna. Then about 1 minute later, he contacted Stevens. That night, Shauna went to work at the Palms just like she always did. She served drinks. She moved through the casino. She completed her shift. At 3:01 in the morning on September 29th, surveillance cameras recorded her clocking out. Those were the final public images of her alive. She drove home. Inside the townhouse, Stevens had already been waiting for hours. He was in the downstairs bathroom in the dark, wearing a mask and gloves, holding a wood-handled hammer. Shauna entered through the garage. She walked through the townhouse, and as she passed the bathroom, Stevens stepped out. According to the evidence later presented in court, Shauna asked him why he was doing this. He did not respond. He struck her in the head. She fell. Then he got on top of her and continued striking her. The wooden handle broke. He kept going with the metal portion. The injuries told the story of what those final moments looked like. Skull fractures, repeated blunt force trauma, broken fingers from trying to defend herself. Evidence that she tried to protect herself until she could not anymore. Shauna Tia was 46 years old. After the attack, Stevens followed the plan as best he could. He took her purse, which contained more than $1, Nozo Zero in cash and casino chips. He left the garage door open as a signal that the job was done. He forgot some items he had hidden in the closet, but he took enough to support the robbery narrative. Then he left. He went to George's house, changed clothes, buried the hammer, and later used an acquaintance to cash some of Shauna's casino chips. And then, in one of the most reckless and revealing moves in the case, he went to see a friend named William Penn, Big Will. Instead of hiding what he had done, Stevens bragged. He laughed. He described killing a woman with a hammer until the hammer broke. He said he had been paid $600 and expected more. That confession would become one of the reasons this case unraveled so fast. Around 9 that same morning, George Thaff went to Shauna's townhouse. He brought Maddie with him. Then he called 911 after discovering Shauna's body. By then, she had already been dead for hours. For investigators, the case was not simple at first. George had what looked like a solid alibi. He had been at the fire station. He was not physically inside the apartment at the time of the murder. And because the attack was so violent, detectives briefly considered whether this could have been a stranger attack. But the case changed almost immediately because of panics. After seeing the murder reported on the news, he went to police and pointed them towards Stevens. That single step changed everything. When detectives located Stevens, he did not immediately admit guilt, but after they confronted him with bloody jeans recovered from his campsite, his position shifted. He led police to the murder weapon. He handed over Shauna's apartment key, and from there, the prosecution constructed a case that did not depend on Stevens alone. The physical evidence was strong. His DNA was connected to key items. Shauna's DNA was found on the murder weapon. There was forensic evidence linking Stevens to the scene and linking the aftermath back to George's orbit. The digital evidence was equally damaging. In September 2012 alone, George and Stevens exchanged 87 phone calls and 26 text messages. On the night before the murder, George ended a call with Shauna and then contacted Stevens within a minute. That kind of timing is difficult to explain away. Then there was the surveillance, the shopping trips, the gloves, the dark clothing, the hammers, the knife, the cash purchases. Gradually, the case stopped being one man's confession and became a fully supported murder for hire prosecution. Then George's own behavior after the murder added another layer. After investigators confronted his family and made it clear he was a suspect, George drove his truck at high speed and collided with a concrete barrier. Detectives believed it may have been a suicide attempt. By then, the image of the respectable firefighter husband was beginning to collapse. In January 2013, Noel Stevens pleaded guilty to murder and related charges. In exchange for his cooperation, the state did not pursue the death penalty against him. George pleaded not guilty, so the case moved toward trial. When the trial finally began in August 2015, the jury was shown the full structure of the crime. Not just the killing, the planning, the calls, the purchases, the key, the earlier break-in, the failed attempts, the staging of the scene, the garage door opener detail. And the prosecution's theory was clear. George Thaff may not have physically swung the hammer, but he made the murder possible at every stage. The defense tried to challenge Stevens, and not without reason. He was unstable. He had a criminal record. He was violent. He was absolutely the kind of witness a defense team would want a jury to question. But the problem for George was that the state had too much corroboration. Too many calls, too many purchases, too many details Stevens could not have fabricated on his own. On September 3, 2015, the jury found George Thaff guilty on all 7 counts. The next day, they imposed the harshest sentence available for the murder count, life without parole. Later, the judge added additional consecutive prison time and described the plot in chilling terms. Then on January 7, 2016, Noel Stevens was sentenced to 42 years to life. That was the legal conclusion of the core case. But understanding what happened here requires more than just knowing who got convicted. It requires understanding what kind of crime this really was. Technical analysis. From an investigative standpoint, this case became strong because it did not rely on a single pillar. If all police had was no Stevens' word, the defense could have portrayed him as a manipulative addict trying to save himself. But that is not what happened. The case had layers. There was the confession to Penn, the recovery of the murder weapon, the apartment key, the bloody jeans, the DNA, the phone records, the surveillance footage, the cash purchases, the casino chips, the failed attempts that explained why this murder had taken so long to happen. That is what made the prosecution's theory so durable. And the phone evidence in particular was devastating because it gave the relationship between George and Stevens structure and timing. It showed repeated contact before the murder, crucial communication near the murder, and a volume of contact that made coincidence almost impossible to believe. This was also a strong case because the staging failed. The robbery story was not clean enough. Stevens forgot items. He spoke too much. He left evidence behind. He behaved like exactly what he was. Not a professional hitman, but a chaotic, violent man being used in a murder plot. He was not careful enough to fully conceal. That sloppiness is one reason the truth surfaced. Psychological analysis. George Ty, as presented by the prosecution, fits one of the most unsettling profiles in true crime. The controlled, respectable, organized offender. He was not impulsive. He was not chaotic. He did not erupt in one moment of rage and lose control. He planned. He calculated. He thought ahead. He discussed methods. He considered evidence. He thought about suspicion before the killing even happened. That kind of mindset is chilling because it suggests a person who did not just want the problem gone. He wanted the solution to look clean, and the motive prosecutors built around him was not random either. This case looks deeply tied to control. Control over money, control over divorce, control over image, control over what happened next. Instead of adjusting to the fact that his marriage was ending and that family court might cost him financially, the state argued that George chose to eliminate the person standing on the other side of that loss. Then there is Noel Stevens. He is almost the opposite profile. Less controlled, less disciplined, more chaotic, more impulsive, more visibly violent. The kind of person who could carry out a brutal act and then boast about it the same day. And that contrast matters because it helps explain why the partnership existed at all. George had the structure, Stevens had the violence, one planned, the other carried out, and then there is Shauna. What makes her story so heartbreaking is that nothing in her final months necessarily looked from the outside like an active murder plot. It looked like a bad separation, a difficult marriage, a creepy handyman, a burglary, counseling, co-parenting stress. That is exactly why intimate partner violence can be so dangerous. Sometimes the threat does not look like a threat until it is far too late. If this case stayed with you, let me know in the comments what part hit you the hardest. Was it the planning, the repeated failed attempts, the fact that Shauna was still trying to save the marriage, or the fact that the whole thing nearly looked like a random robbery? If you want more true crime cases told with full context and careful detail, subscribe. And most importantly, remember her name, Shauna Tafe, because behind every headline like this, there was once a real person living an ordinary life, never knowing how close the danger already was. Shaneka Schamberger. On March 12, 2016, in a quiet part of Greensboro, North Carolina, a neighborhood cookout was happening. And while it went on, tension broke out, but it seemed ordinary. Voices had already been raised earlier in the day. People had argued, cooled off, then drifted back together. It felt like one of those moments most people have seen before, where something almost turns into a fight, but doesn't. The difference here is that this one didn't settle down. It carried forward slowly into a driveway, and in less than 2 seconds, it turned into a homicide that would later be argued all the way up to the North Carolina Court of Appeals. Marcus James McQueen was there that day. He was 40 years old, someone known in that neighborhood. Shaneka Chanel Schamberger was there too, staying at the house where the gathering was happening. Earlier, the argument had started over something small, moonshine. It wasn't the kind of issue that usually leads to anything permanent, but it didn't end cleanly. According to trial testimony later summarized by the appellate court, Schamberger stepped in at one point and told people to stop arguing. When that didn't work, she told McQueen directly to leave, but he refused. That refusal mattered because from that point on, the situation never reset. Time passed, people moved outside, the setting shifted into the driveway. That's where everything tightened. Witnesses later described that Schamberger and McQueen were still going back and forth, still having words, and then it reached a point where it wasn't just noise anymore. One witness said Schamberger looked at him and said, "You don't know who you're effing with. I will kill you." McQueen answered back, "Ain't nobody going to mess with me." That exchange locked the tone of what was coming next. It wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was direct, personal, and escalating. McQueen was sitting on a bucket to the right side of the truck at that point. That detail stayed consistent in the record because it fixed where he was when everything happened next. Schamberger got into the truck she had driven before, including earlier that same day, and she started it. A witness said she looked at McQueen for a few seconds, not a glance. It was long enough for someone to notice and later describe it. Then the engine revved. From there, the timeline compresses. According to the defense expert's testimony, once the truck started moving, everything that followed happened in about 1.9 seconds. That's not even enough time for most people to fully process what they're seeing. The truck moved forward. It went directly toward McQueen. It ran over him, and it didn't stop there. It kept going until it struck a nearby house. That entire physical sequence from movement to impact with the house fit inside that 1.9-second window. McQueen was pinned under the truck. He died at the scene. In the immediate aftermath, someone nearby said the police needed to be called. According to testimony preserved in the appellate record, Schamberger responded, "F it, call the police." That moment stayed with the case because it gave the jury something to weigh right alongside everything else. What was said before, what was done during, and what was said immediately after. When the case moved into court, the central issue wasn't whether McQueen had been run over. That part was clear. The question was, what was going on in Schamberger's mind in that moment? The state built its case around malice, arguing that the way the truck was used, combined with the words in the sequence, showed a reckless and wanton disregard for human life. The defense took a different path. Schamberger testified that she did not intend to hit or kill Queen. She said she believed the truck was in reverse, not drive. She said the gear indicator was stuck in the park position and didn't move when the vehicle was shifted, and that she didn't realize what had happened until after the truck hit the house and she got out. That claim brought in expert testimony. Both sides agreed on one key point. The gear indicator did not properly show the position when the truck was in park, neutral, or drive. But that's where the agreement stopped. The state's expert said there was no issue with actually putting the truck into gear or operating it. The defense expert said mechanically, everything appeared connected and working as it should, even though the indicator itself didn't display correctly. Neither expert identified a failure that would make the truck uncontrollable. That mattered because it meant the case came down less to mechanical failure and more to how the driver used the vehicle. At trial, the jury was instructed on first-degree murder B1, second-degree murder, and B2, second-degree murder. They were also instructed on accident. The judge told them clearly that a killing is accidental if it is unintentional, happens during lawful conduct, and does not involve culpable, and that the state had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the death was not accidental before they could return a guilty verdict. So, the jury had the full range in front of them, from intentional killing with premeditation all the way down to accident. On May 15, 2018, they made their decision. If you're following so far, then I'd really appreciate it if you like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't. I'm super grateful for all the support so far. Thank you very much. So, the jury had the full range in front of them, from intentional killing with premeditation all the way down to accident. They convicted Shenika Schamberger of B1 second-degree murder. The court then sentenced her to 276 to 344 months in prison, just over 23 years to nearly 29 years. The case didn't end there. It moved to the North Carolina Court of Appeals. On appeal, Schamberger argued that the trial court should have used more specific accident language in the final instructions, and should have instructed the jury on involuntary manslaughter. In 2019, the Court of Appeals rejected both arguments. The court said that when the instructions were read as a whole, the jury had a clear path to return a not guilty verdict if they believed the death was accidental. The court also ruled that an involuntary manslaughter instruction wasn't required on these facts. Even taking her testimony at face value, the court said the evidence supported an accident theory, but not a lesser negligent killing. They also pointed out something that cuts through the mechanical argument. Schamberger already knew about the gear indicator issue and had driven that same truck without incident, including earlier that day. So the faulty indicator was not considered the cause of what happened. The case didn't lead to a new law, and it didn't create some sweeping policy change. What it did do was reinforce how existing law works in a situation like this. How a vehicle, depending on how it's used, can meet the legal standard for second-degree murder, and how courts evaluate claims of accident versus criminal responsibility when everything happens in a moment that can't be taken back.